Hello everyone, welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. 911. What's the location of your emergency? Broccoli Drive, Dillmer, New York. Okay, Broccoli, yes, and what's the problem? There's a 55-year-old white male down on the ground. We have a court officer on the scene. 55-year-old male, yes. An armed court officer on the scene. He's on the scene, yes. Okay, the guy did not show up for work today. He's unresponsive. He's unresponsive on November 15, 2004. 52-year-old Peter Porco was found dead at the bottom of the stairs of his Dillmer, New York home after having suffered massive head trauma. His wife John Porco was found in the upstairs bedroom, her skull severely fractured in an attack that destroyed one of her eyes. The Porcos were found by one of Peter's colleagues who'd come to conduct a wellness check after Peter hadn't come into work that day. What he saw that day will probably haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. Who could have committed such a brutal act? That's what we're going to unpack today as we dive into the case of Peter Porco and the disfigurement of his wife Joan. Peter and Joan were the sort of people that represented middle America at the turn of the millennium. Both of them were well-respected professionals, with Peter working as a clerk in the New York State Appellate Division Court and Joan as a children's speech pathologist. They had two sons, Jonathan and Christopher, and by all accounts the Porcos were the picture of a happy family. They were also deeply religious, with Joan practicing so devoutly that she went to church every single day. Both their sons had a knack for academics, with Christopher also showing a certain level of charm that his more introverted older brother somewhat lacked. Their home in Dillmer was located in a neighborhood where crime was basically unheard of. That's just the kind of place you can afford when you work such good jobs, and it's safe to say that no one could have expected such a violent attack on the couple in their home. The brutality of the attack is what makes it stand out. As soon as police arrived on the scene, they could tell there was something personal behind the attacks. One of the detectives, knowing that family members are usually prime suspects in cases such as this, asked Joan, who was still barely clinging to life, if a relative had done this to her. Joan managed a weak nod. The detective then asked if this was Jonathan's doing, only for Joan to shake her head. But when he asked about Christopher, the outgoing popular child, the one that seemed to have no trouble making friends, Joan nodded, indicating that he brutalized his parents. If we look deeper into Christopher's background, we'll start to understand how unsurprising it actually is that he did something like this. If anyone looked at Christopher back in those days, they'd see a real charmer. They'd see someone intelligent and sharp, the consummate smooth talker. Only parts of that impression would be true and not the good parts. Christopher Porco was indeed someone that could talk his way out of anything, or at least he saw himself that way, and yet he wasn't intelligent so much as cunning, and he wasn't charming so much as manipulative. Porco's moral compass was weak at best. Many would say that he lacked one entirely, but could he really be responsible for the murder of his own father? First, we must understand Porco's past prior to the incident. It's certainly a checkered one, with countless instances of Porco showing a gross lack of moral judgment. For one thing, Porco was a pathological liar. He came from a solid middle-class background, but this didn't seem to be enough for him. After enrolling at Rochester University in 2001, he tried to reinvent himself as the scion of an incredibly wealthy family. He claimed that his dad owned properties all across the world, from exotic locations like Aruba to the peaceful woodlands of Vermont. What he wanted more than anything else was to impress other people. He lived for validation. Indeed, he had a tendency to get violent at times. Possibly whenever his social status was questioned. This violent streak wasn't just a one-off either. There were plenty of instances where Porco would get uncontrollably angry so much that people worried he might hurt them. On one occasion Porco went so far as to threaten a female classmate, saying that he'd kill her. Another incident saw him try to strangle a fellow student at a party, and he might have committed murder then and there if bystanders hadn't stepped in. Porco's most obvious quality was his sheer laziness and entitlement. It's not like he was dumb, far from it. Actually, if he applied himself he could have gone far to do great things. Instead, he felt like the world owed him something and that he shouldn't have to work hard to get what he wants more than anything else. Porco had a strange detachment from the people around him. One could even say that he could be icy. At times his relationship with his brother was strained at best, and it seemed like he had an almost transactional relationship with his father, or to be more accurate, Porco often tried to take financial advantage of his father, but that's something we should get into later. First we have to cover the chilling calm with which he received the news about the attack. Porco apparently found out about his parents' murder on the news and called into the Dulmer police station to inquire about it. His tone seemed like that of someone ordering a pizza, detached, unemotional, bored even. It's like he just found out about some war breaking out in a far-off land, as if the news didn't really have any effect on him. Some might say that he didn't have any confirmation of the attack just yet, only a news report that he was trying to corroborate, but most people would have been absolutely distraught if there was any chance that their loved ones had come to harm. Porco was eventually able to get in touch with a detective and called him back at the station after experiencing some reception issues. Chris claimed it had been 3 weeks since he'd seen his parents, which meant that it would have been impossible for him to be the culprit. Why then? Had his mother nodded yes when the detective asked if the attack was his doing. That might have something to do with the fraud Christopher had been repeatedly involved in over the past few years. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. As we've mentioned before, Porco liked to be seen as the big man on campus. Of course, this required a massive amount of cash to host parties and generally make himself seem like a cool dude. Each round of drinks he paid for bought him some social capital. Each party he hosted got him in with some fraternity or another. He made gifts to frat brothers to make sure he stayed in their good graces. But where did all this money come from? At some point in the early 2000s, Porco started stealing from his parents. Police investigations revealed that the Porco home had been broken into previously, but at least 2 of these instances were Christopher's doing while he was home for Thanksgiving in 2002. Porco staged a break-in at his family's residence. This involved cutting into a window screen and stealing 2 laptops belonging to his parents, which he later sold when his parents bought replacement laptops. Porco staged yet another break-in using the proceeds to fund his lavish university lifestyle. According to the man who would later try to prosecute Porco, this staged break-in was consistent with what police found on the day of Peter Porco's murder. The earlier investigation where Jones' laptop was stolen, one of the screen windows, the screen was cut, and the police thought that that was the means of entry to the burglar who stole Jones' laptop. In investigating the murder, the screen in the garage window was cut. Okay, so it was like a commonality, like if this was an intruder, you know you've got the cuckreen. When an intruder got in one point in Thanksgiving, I think it was, that's right, the year before, and then the cut screen in the garage at the time of the homicide. Though his parents reported the break-ins to the police, they weren't able to find evidence of any wrongdoing. This essentially fueled Porco's notion that he could do whatever he wanted without having to face any consequences. Of course, he couldn't fund his lifestyle through petty theft alone. He also had a part-time job at a veterinary clinic, but this turned out to be just another notch Porco added to his burglary belt. The clinic opened up one day to find several electronics and other valuables missing. Porco sold them all on eBay and was never caught for his actions. When he ran out of things to steal, Porco turned to online scams. He'd put items up on eBay, and when they were sold he'd call the buyer pretending to be his brother and claim that Christopher Porco was dead. E-commerce was still in its early stages, and so people had very few options to verify what happened or even to recoup their money. All in all, Porco was able to maintain an impressive cash flow. Throughout much of his university tenure he was able to maintain the appearance of being an upper-class socialite and partied harder than possibly anyone else at college, but that also meant that he had very little time to do any actual studying. In 2003, Porco was expelled from Rochester University due to his poor grades. His parents were disappointed, but they still wanted to support their son, so they helped him enroll at Hudson Community College and came up with a plan to get him back on track. Unfortunately, there was just no helping Christopher Porco. He continued skipping classes and ended the semester with absolutely terrible grades. In March of 2004, Porco claimed that he'd been working real hard and deserved a break, and successfully convinced his parents to pay for a trip to London. During this trip, Porco received an email from his mother with the subject line in this email: Joan talked about how her son needed to explain himself after failing his classes at community college. Porco responded to this by saying that there'd simply been a mix-up and that the lowest grade he got was a B. He claimed that there was nothing to worry about and that he'd be back at Rochester in no time. This involved even more forgery from Porco. He created fake transcripts that showed him getting A's and B's across the board and showed them to his parents. These forgeries were so accurate that they even allowed him to get back into Rochester, but there was still the matter of paying his tuition. Now, Porco claimed that a professor had misplaced his final exam, which had made his final grade seem much lower than it actually was. He also said that the university was waiving his semester fee due to this mishap, but since nothing of the sort had happened, Porco decided to apply for a loan under his father's name. His dad knew about the loan, but he thought his son just needed $2,000 for some textbooks. Imagine his surprise when he found out that the loan was actually for a whopping $31,000, and that's not all. Porco had apparently used his father's financial information to secure an additional loan of $16,000 just for his personal use. And what did Porco do with all this money? While he did pay his university tuition, the amount he'd received was way more than what he needed, and he used the excess cash to buy himself a yellow Jeep Wrangler. Once Peter found out about this, he sent a furious email to his son, threatening legal action. Loans of this amount under Peter's name would affect his credit rating and just cause a lot of other problems. Besides, Joan sent an email as well, though this one expressed concern for her son's mental state and told him that she still loved him despite how disappointed she was. Porco ignored both emails. He knew that something needed to be done. The mask was fully off, and Porco felt it was time for some drastic measures. Police reports and later investigations paint a pretty clear picture of what Porco did. On November 15, he left college at around 10:36 the previous night, which can be proven by the tolls he paid along the way. He made the 200-mile drive to his parents' residence, and he arrived at around 2 a.m. At 2:14 he disabled the alarm after using his key to unlock the front door. He then picks up an axe from the garage, goes up to his parents' bedroom and starts hacking away at them. Peter was struck 16 times in the head with blows so severe that they cracked straight through his skull. Joan had defensive wounds indicating that she'd been awake during the attack. Both Peter and Joan were found with their jaws partially detached by the attack, with the blows severing the ligaments and tendons holding them together. One of Joan's eyes was also split in half, with the other being slightly damaged as well. Over the next 2 hours, Porco cleaned himself up and tried to make the attack seem like a random break-in. He smashed the alarm system and cut the phone lines, although the alarm system records had already registered him putting the code in hours prior. Shortly after 5 00A.M. Porco's yellow Jeep was seen driving towards his university, and at 8:30 he was spotted jogging on campus. It's likely that he'd gone for a jog so that he could have an alibi for later back at Peter and Joan's residence. Their bodies lay covered in blood and gore on their beds, but the absolutely shocking thing was that neither of them were dead yet. Joan was barely conscious, but when Peter's alarm rang he actually got up and turned it off. It seemed like he still retained some basic motor functions and followed his morning routine as if nothing happened. Blood and brain matter was found in the bathroom, indicating that Peter had gone there and possibly even seen himself in the mirror, but his damaged brain couldn't register what it was looking at. Peter even tried to clean the blood that dripped into the sink, unaware of what it was or where it came from. He then went on to prepare lunch and even tried to load the dishwasher. In a heartbreaking show of his continued affection for his son, he even wrote a check out to Christopher, possibly because supporting his son was always at the forefront of his mind. Eventually the massive blood loss took its toll and Peter collapsed at the foot of the stairs. His colleague later phoned the incident in and an investigation ensued. All the while Christopher Porco waited at college, assuming that he'd once again gotten away with it. Porco clearly thought that he was too smart for the police, but they were able to track his movements through CCTV footage. He claimed that he'd been asleep on the dorm room couch that night, but it turned out that a group of students had been there, effectively canceling out his alibi. We were lucky enough that Chris told that same story to everybody, not just the police. He told it to his uncle when his uncle came to pick him up. I slept in the lounge all night. He told it to all his friends. He repeatedly told people at the hospital, you know, where were you, Chris? I was at school. I was sleeping in the lounge all night. And while Chris was being interviewed, there were Bethlehem police at the school interviewing people in the dorm who all said unluck for Chris. They all, for some reason, that Sunday night sat up watching a movie in the lounge, a whole group of kids. Shrek 2, I remember the name of the movie, and they all said Porco wasn't here. Porco was not in the lounge. He had given up his bed right to his fraternity president who was visiting. No one saw Porco in the dorm lounge that night, even though a huge group of students had been watching a movie there. This wasn't the only piece of circumstantial evidence against Porco either. His car had been spotted going to and from his parents' residence. The security log indicated that whoever entered the home knew the passcode, and there was also the fact that Porco would have received $1.10 million from his parents' insurance payout. When police gathered evidence, Joan woke up at the hospital and didn't look anything like her former self, but she was alive and looked surprisingly good for someone that had nearly been butchered with an axe. The most surprising thing of all was that she recanted her accusation against her son. She claimed to have no memory of what happened and said that her son would never harm her. A year after Peter's murder, Christopher was arrested and charged with second-degree homicide and attempted murder. His bail was set at $250,000, which was mostly paid by his mother while he was out on bail. Joan even threw him a birthday party to show her support for him. When it came time for him to go to court, she was right there with him, her arm in his, still refusing to believe that her son was the one that attacked her. The jury eventually disregarded her implication of her son because she may have been too traumatized to fully understand what had happened. Despite this, the rest of the evidence was more than enough. Mr. Porco, count 1, murdered in the 2nd grade. What's your verdict? Guilty. Porco was sentenced to 50 years for each count, and he'll be eligible for parole in 2022, by which point he'll be 69 years old. Porco maintains his innocence to this day. I'll ask you the obvious question again, Chris, did you do this crime? I didn't. I had nothing to do with this. I've said that from day one, and it's the truth. Story 2. Sometimes the darkest evil hides behind the most unexpected faces. Take Vincent Brothers for example, a high school vice principal who was known for his love of children and his reputation in the community, but in July 2003 that image would come crashing down, when a shocking quintuple homicide rocked Bakersfield, California. 5 members of a family, including a helpless infant, were murdered in cold blood in their own home. Officers later revealed the crime was driven by pure hatred, and if it hadn't been for something as unexpected as dead insects, justice might never have been served. So what drove a man so high up in society to sink so low and wipe out an entire family? This is the chilling story of the Harper family, and today we're diving deep into the truth behind the tragedy. Let's start by getting to know Joni Harper, a woman whose life began on November 14, 1963. In Bakersfield, California, Joni was the youngest of 5 children born to Ernestine Harper, and she spent her entire life in Bakersfield, a city she would come to love and call home. Joni's education began at McKinley Elementary, and from there she moved on to Bakersfield High School, where she graduated in 1988. Even in high school, Joni was already showing signs of being a standout. She was an exceptional athlete, excelling in multiple sports, but it was basketball that truly made her shine on the court. She was a force to be reckoned with, and her talent earned her recognition throughout her years at Bakersfield High. After high school, Joni's passion for basketball didn't fade. She took her skills to Southwestern Christian College in Texas, where she earned an associate's degree. But even with her own basketball career ahead of her, Joni found a new way to stay connected to the sport. In 1994, she made history by becoming the first woman in Kern County to officiate boys' basketball games. Her love for the game continued to grow, and soon she was officiating games for the North Bakersfield Recreation and Park District, as well as for the California Athletic Collegiate Association. Through her years in the basketball community, Joni became a well-known and respected figure. People admired her not just for her skills but for her dedication and passion for the sport. But those who knew her best would tell you that while basketball was important to her, her true calling was helping children. Joni shared this passion with her mother Ernestine, who had always instilled in her the importance of giving back to others. Ernestine, Joni's mother, was a woman with a story that spanned more than just her years in California. Originally from Texas, she made the bold decision to move to California in 1961, and by 1964 she had settled in Bakersfield. It was there that Ernestine's passion for helping others truly took root. She quickly became known as a strong, non-nonsense community activist, someone who wasn't afraid to stand up for the underdog. And Ernestine didn't just talk the talk, she walked the walk. She fought tirelessly for those whose society often forgot, such as the poor, the disenfranchised, and the marginalized. Her belief in fairness was unwavering. Ernestine, deeply grounded in her Christian faith, believed that no matter where someone came from, how they looked, or how much money they had, they all deserved equal justice and respect. Her dedication to helping others didn't stop at her own community, though. As a co-founder of an organization called Extend a Hand for Justice, Ernestine extended her reach far beyond Bakersfield. She traveled to Africa and South America as a missionary, bringing aid, money, and resources to some of the most impoverished communities in the world. Ernestine's heart was as big as it was generous, and it's no surprise that Joni inherited that same spirit of compassion. Joni had a deep respect for her mother, and their bond only grew stronger as the years passed. Though Ernestine had 4 other children, her relationship with Joni was uniquely special. So when Joni was ready to start her own family, Ernestine was right there by her side, always ready to lend a helping hand. This is where Vincent Brothers entered the picture. In the late 1990s, Joni met a man who seemed like a dream come true. Vincent was originally from Long Island and had moved to California in the 1980s to attend Cal State Bakersfield. There he earned a master's degree in education and began working his way up in the school system. By all accounts, Vincent appeared to be the perfect match for Joni. He was charming, ambitious, and had a stable Career working at a local elementary school. To Joni's family he seemed like a really nice guy, and Joni quickly fell in love with him, though Vincent had been married twice before and had a child from a previous relationship. Things seemed to be looking up when he and Joni welcomed their first child together, a son they named Marquez, in 1998. Just 2 years later, in January of 2000, the couple tied the knot, and for a while it seemed like they were on their way to the picture-perfect life, but as with many fairy tales, things took a dark turn. Behind the scenes, Vincent began disappearing for days at a time, and when he returned he was secretive, refusing to explain where he had been or who he had been with. Joni, heartbroken but sharp, started to piece the puzzle together. She realized the man she had married was betraying her. A month after their wedding, Joni made the painful decision to have their marriage annulled, but despite the heartbreak, this wasn't the end of their story. According to Joni's brother, Vincent was still the love of her life, and Joni wasn't ready to completely let go. She wanted Vincent to be a father to their son, and so the couple continued their on-again, off-again relationship. Then, as if things weren't complicated enough, Joni discovered she was pregnant again. This time it was a girl, and Joni named her Lindsay, and sadly this didn't stop Vincent from continuing his extramarital issues. By the time Lindsay was born, Joni's mother Ernestine decided to move in with her daughter to help take care of the kids, especially since Vincent wasn't always around. But after being apart for a few years, Joni and Vincent decided to give their relationship another shot. By the end of 2002 they found out they were expecting their third child together, a surprise that for a moment brought them hope. So 3 years after their first wedding, Joni and Vincent secretly remarried in January of 2003. They were starting fresh, or so it seemed, but by April of that same year things began to unravel again. Vincent slipped back into his old ways, disappearing for days at a time, leaving Joni feeling more alone than ever. She confided in a friend, telling them that she was afraid Vincent might try to do something drastic to get rid of her. It was a heartbreaking moment for Joni, who just wanted peace and stability for her family despite all the tension. Joni gave birth to their third child, a baby boy named Marshall, just 4 months after their remarriage. But by the time Marshall arrived, it was clear that their second marriage had already hit a point of no return. Additionally, things weren't getting any better inside the home. Ernestine, who had been living with Joni to help with the kids, found herself constantly clashing with Vincent. The tension between the two became too much to handle, and eventually Vincent moved out into his own apartment. However, neither Joni nor Vincent took the steps to officially divorce, but their connection was fading because of all the chaos. Church had always been a refuge for Joni and her family. The Baker Street Church of Christ wasn't just a place they went to on Sundays, it was like a second home. Their church family was a huge part of their lives, providing support, friendship, and a sense of community. Joni couldn't wait for everyone to meet baby Marshall, who was growing so fast. So on Sunday, July 6, 2003, Joni, Ernestine, and her 3 children, Marquez, who was 4, Lindsay almost 2, and baby Marshall just 6 weeks old, headed to church for the morning service. This was their usual routine. They'd attend both the morning and evening services, a tradition that had become a comforting part of their lives. Little did they know this seemingly ordinary Sunday would be anything but that. After the morning service ended, the Harper family decided to stop and grab a bite to eat before heading home to rest up for the evening service. However, when the evening service rolled around, the family didn't return to church. At first, people in the congregation thought it was a little odd. They were usually so punctual, but they figured maybe Joni and the kids were just too tired to come back. After all, Joni had a newborn and 2 young kids, so it wasn't entirely out of the question that she'd need a break. But then after the family left church and returned home, no one had heard from them. 2 days passed and still no one had been able to get in touch with Joni or Ernestine. Friends and family members who called them got no answer, and that's When the worry really started to set in, Kelsey Span, Joni's best friend, someone she considered a sister, knew something wasn't right. She decided to go over to the Harper house and check on them herself. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. On Tuesday, July 8, 2 days after anyone hadn't heard from the Harper family, Kelsey arrived at the house. She walked in expecting to find them maybe napping or busy with the kids, but instead she walked straight into a nightmare. Joni, Ernestine and the children Marquez, Lindsay and baby Marshall were all dead. They had been shot. The house was a crime scene with 222 caliber shell casings scattered across the floor. The crime shook our community to the core. It was something that the city of Bakersfield had never dealt with before. When the police finally arrived at the Harper home, they were greeted by a scene that was nothing short of horrifying. The house had been turned upside down, drawers were pulled open, cabinets were flung wide, and items were strewn across the floor. It seemed like a robbery gone terribly wrong, but something didn't sit right with the investigators. As they carefully examined the scene, they made a chilling discovery. Joni was lying lifeless, and not only had she been shot, but she had also been brutally stabbed. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a random act of violence, it was a crime of passion. The knife used to stab Joni was missing, but a closer look revealed that it had been taken from the kitchen. There was a knife missing from the butcher block, and that was a detail that raised more suspicions. The killer had clearly planned the attack using an item from the home, which made the crime feel more personal. The investigators also noted that the killer had entered through the sliding glass door, but curiously there were no signs of forced entry, nothing to suggest a struggle or that the intruder had been trying to sneak in. It was almost as if the killer was invited in, or at least had a way of getting in without raising suspicion. On top of that, despite the mess in the house, nothing valuable seemed to be missing. There was no sign of typical robbery, no electronics, jewelry or cash gone, so the detectives quickly started to form a theory. Joni had been the target of the attack, but why? And more hauntingly, why kill her 3 children, including her 6-week-old baby? As the investigation continued, the detectives dug deeper into Joni's life. They learned she was married to a man named Vincent, and that's when they realized they needed to track him down. After all, he was her husband and the first person they needed to speak with. They also needed to rule him out as a suspect, so they set out to find Vincent, but it wasn't as simple as they hoped. It turned out that Vincent wasn't even in Bakersfield when the murders occurred. Vincent had flown out of town on July 2, heading first to Ohio to visit his brother and then on to North Carolina to see his mother. So while the police in Bakersfield were dealing with this horrific crime scene, Vincent was thousands of miles away. When they finally managed to locate him in Elizabethtown, North Carolina, they had to break the devastating news, and when they did, Vincent's reaction was gut-wrenching. According to the detective who interviewed him, he was completely overcome with emotion, inconsolable in his grief. At one point he even asked for a trash can, fearing he might be sick to his stomach from the shock. However, despite his emotional state, the detectives found it hard to gauge his true feelings. From all appearances, he had a solid alibi. He was hundreds of miles away when the murders occurred, visiting his family in North Carolina, but something about his reaction didn't sit well with the investigators. To truly confirm Vincent's alibi, the detectives went Allen, determined to be absolutely certain that he had been in Ohio on the day the murders occurred. They combed through his credit card statements and found purchases made in Ohio on July 6, the day they believed the family had been killed. There had been credit card activity on Vincent's brother's credit card on Sunday, July 6 in Columbus, Ohio. At first glance, this appeared to be solid evidence that Vincent was where he claimed to be, hundreds of miles away from Bakersfield. His alibi seemed rock solid. After all, Vincent was a vice principal at John C. Fremont Elementary School in Bakersfield, California. It was Hard to imagine someone in such a professional role being capable of something so horrific, so the investigators turned their attention to the Harper family for more clues. One of the first people they spoke to was Joni's brother Eddie Harper. The news came to him in stages, like a nightmare unfolding bit by bit. At first he received a call from his cousin saying that Joni and her daughter Lindsay had been shot. Then a couple of hours later, the cousin called back, but this time the news was worse. Not only had Joni and Lindsay been killed, but Marcus and Ernestine had also met the same tragic fate. Eddie's world came crashing down. But it wasn't until the third call that he heard the full horrifying truth. Every single member of his family, Joni, Ernestine, Marcus, Lindsay and little baby Marshall, was gone. Detectives quickly ruled him out as a suspect, as there was no solid evidence linking him to the crime. With that lead fading fast, they began to explore other angles, including whether the Harper family might have had any enemies. The Harpers were known for their activism and generosity within the community, which raised the possibility that their actions could have upset someone. Perhaps an individual felt threatened or offended by their advocacy work. However, when speaking to the family's church members, this theory seemed very unlikely. Everyone who knew the Harpers described them as kind, selfless and generous. Even Vincent, who had cheated on Joni multiple times, had been forgiven repeatedly by the family. It didn't make sense that anyone would harbor such deep animosity toward them to justify such a horrific act. Realizing this lead was a dead end, detectives turned their focus back to Vincent. They knew they couldn't afford to leave any stone unturned in a case this shocking. Whoever committed the murders needed to be caught quickly, and every detail of Vincent's alibi came under intense scrutiny. Initially, Vincent's alibi appeared watertight. Credit card purchases placed him in Ohio on the day of the murders, suggesting he was far away when the crime occurred. But detectives weren't satisfied with just the paper trail. They wanted to see for themselves. They obtained surveillance footage from the stores where the purchases were made, and that's when the first crack appeared in Vincent's story. The man seen on camera using Vincent's credit card wasn't Vincent, it was his brother Melvin, who bore a striking resemblance to him in height and build. Investigators brought Melvin in for questioning. At first he denied using his brother's credit cards, but as detectives pressed him, the truth unraveled. Eventually Melvin admitted he had indeed used Vincent's cards. Not only that, but Vincent had given him detailed instructions on what to buy. This confession was a bombshell. While it proved that Melvin was the one making the purchases, it didn't necessarily clear Vincent. Melvin claimed Vincent had been in Ohio with him the entire weekend. A point Vincent's lawyer reiterated, explaining that it wasn't unusual for Vincent to lend his card to help his brother. According to his lawyer, Vincent had spent Friday with his brother Melvin and the rest of the weekend with another brother, Troy. The lawyer even claimed that witnesses outside of Vincent's family could confirm he was in Ohio the entire time, but detectives weren't buying it. Melvin had already lied during his interrogation, and there was no solid proof, no receipts or records that backed up Vincent's whereabouts during his supposed visit with Troy. So the investigators kept digging, determined to figure out what really happened. When detectives took a closer look at Vincent's travel history, the details got suspicious fast. They confirmed that on July 2 Vincent flew from California to Columbus, Ohio. Once there, he rented a car and drove to Melvin's house. So far so normal, right? But when they checked the odometer of the rental car, things got weird. Between July 2 and July 11 the car had racked up over 400 m, an absurd number for someone who was supposedly just driving around Ohio. When police calculated the distance, it became clear the car had been driven all the way to California and back during that time frame. This was a huge breakthrough. Detectives now believe they had pieced together what happened. Vincent had flown to Ohio to set up an alibi. Once there, he drove the rental car back to California, committed the murders, and then drove all the way back to Ohio to keep up the appearance that he'd been there the entire time, but even with this theory the police needed more evidence to nail it down. They teamed up with the Bakersfield Police Department and the FBI to bring the rental car into a lab. Their plan to analyze the car's radiator for bugs. If the car had really been driven cross-country, the radiator might contain insects specific to California, which would blow Vincent's alibi wide open, and when the results came back they confirmed what detectives had suspected. Several of the bugs found in the car were species native to California and areas west of the Rocky Mountains. It was damning evidence that tied Vincent's rental car, and likely Vincent himself, to the region where the murders occurred. His carefully crafted alibi was crumbling faster than anyone could have anticipated, but as investigators dug even deeper they unearthed something even more chilling about Vincent's past. On the surface he was a respected vice principal with a polished reputation, but behind closed doors his history painted a far darker picture. In 1988, during his first marriage, Vincent had been convicted of misdemeanor spousal abuse. According to police records, he served 6 days in jail. His wife at the time divorced him, citing his violent behavior. Fast forward to 1992, Vincent remarried, but the marriage quickly soured. By 1993, his second wife filed for divorce, alleging that Vincent had threatened to kill her. The accusations were severe, but they didn't seem to leave a lasting dent in his public image. Then came the incident in 1996, when Vincent was accused of assaulting a co-worker. According to the woman's account, she went to his house one day where he allegedly attacked her, dragged her into a room and took photographs of her against her will. When she tried to call the police, Vincent reportedly yanked the phone from her hands, preventing her from seeking help. The story didn't end there. The woman claimed that Vincent harassed her relentlessly at work. He allegedly touched her inappropriately, called her at home, and even threatened her. She eventually took a leave of absence, stating that Vincent had created a hostile work environment that made it impossible for her to continue. She tried to report these incidents to the police, but instead of support she was allegedly met with resistance. Vincent, standing in the community as a vice principal, seemed to shield him from accountability. While the school district investigated her complaints and warned Vincent about his behavior, no formal punishment followed. So after months of tireless investigation, the police were convinced they had their man. Vincent Brothers, the seemingly upstanding elementary school principal, was the one responsible for the brutal murder of his family. By April 2004, they had pieced together enough evidence to take him down. When officers arrived to arrest him, Vincent didn't look surprised because he wasn't. Turns out he'd been planning to skip town. He had already started selling his belongings and even listed his house for sale. It was the move of a man who knew the walls were closing in for those who knew him. This was a gut punch. How could Vincent, the man who greeted kids with a smile every morning, the same guy parents trusted to guide their children, be accused of slaughtering his own flesh and blood? But here's the thing about wolves and sheep's clothing: no matter how pure they appear, the stains of their true nature always bleed through. In January of 2007, the case finally went to trial. It was a spectacle lasting 4 long months and involving over 100 witnesses. Vincent himself took the stand, denying the charges and maintaining his innocence. The prosecution knew their case was largely circumstantial, but it was undeniably compelling. They carefully outlined their theory, detailing how Vincent had flown to Ohio to establish an alibi, only to secretly drive back to Bakersfield, California to commit the murders before returning to Ohio. Key evidence like the odometer readings from the rental car and the forensic analysis of bugs in the radiator pointed to Vincent having driven across state lines during the time frame of the murders. Prosecutors also highlighted his history of domestic violence, painting a picture of a man with a troubling pattern of behavior. The defense, however, fought back with everything they had. They argued that the prosecution's timeline was not just improbable, it was impossible. A representative from the car rental company testified that odometer readings weren't always recorded accurately, casting doubt on the mileage evidence. Additionally, they claimed there was no direct proof tying Vincent to the crime scene during the murders. The defense tried to poke holes in the prosecution's theory, insisting that Vincent had been in Ohio the entire time, supported by witnesses and his brother's testimonies. But as the trial dragged on, their arguments began to lose traction. After 4 months of testimony and 3 intense days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Despite the defense's efforts, they were not convinced by Vincent's claims of innocence. The circumstantial evidence combined with Vincent's suspicious behavior painted a story the jury believed. In the end, Vincent Brothers was found guilty on all counts. In September of 2007, Vincent Brothers was sentenced to death. As of today, he sits on death row at San Quentin Penitentiary awaiting his fate. It's hard to imagine anyone being so cold and calculating to walk into a home and murder 3 generations of one family. Many people who knew Vincent still struggle to wrap their minds around the idea that he could have been capable of such a thing. Some even question whether the right person was convicted, but for the family and friends of Joni and Ernestine, justice has been served, and they can take some comfort in knowing that their loved one's killer is paying the price for his actions. Story 3: A mentally unstable mother and a father with dissociative amnesia. Who do you think is capable of wiping out an entire family? Brace yourself, because this chilling case will have you questioning everything. Even some of the investigators weren't fully convinced that the man convicted of the murders was the one who actually killed the family, and this has sparked a major debate that still rages on today. So once again, we're diving deep into the case to analyze, was he truly innocent, or is he just a master at pretending to be one? For starters, the Vaughn family was what you'd picture as the perfect American family, a family of 5 that everyone thought had it all together. They were even featured in a local newspaper. With this seemingly carefree photo that quickly went viral. In this picture we see Kimberly Phillips and Christopher Vaughn, a couple who had been together for over a decade, raising 3 children. To the outside world they seemed like the perfect, happy and close-knit family. But little did anyone know their seemingly perfect life was about to take a dark and tragic twist that would shake everything to its core. Kimberly, born in December 1972 in St. Charles, Missouri, grew up in a well-to-do family with 2 sisters, Jennifer and Elizabeth. Interestingly, Jennifer was Kimberly's twin, and Kimberly's family placed a strong emphasis on education and personal development. In fact, she attended a prestigious school, was active in sports, and was known for her friendly, open and sociable nature. On the flip side, we've got Christopher Vaughn, born in September 1974 in St. Louis, Missouri. He grew up in a humble, tight-knit family with 2 brothers. As a kid, he was all about soccer, hiking, camping, and spending time with his family outdoors. These little details might seem random now, but trust me, they'll play a big role later when it comes to piecing together the mystery of what really happened. According to sources, Kimberly and Christopher met in the early 1990s, and it didn't take long for them to fall head over heels for each other. But not everyone was on board with their love story, especially Kimberly's parents. They didn't approve, citing Christopher's age, lack of a stable job, and his less than affluent background. But Kimberly and Christopher weren't about to let anyone stand in their way. They were determined to make it work, and not long after Kimberly found out she was pregnant in the summer of 1994, they tied the knot. Christopher was still a teenager, not yet 20, while Kimberly was just a little older. Despite their youth, they were ready to start a family. Their first child, Abigail, was born just 4 months after the wedding in October of 1994. A year later, their second daughter, Cassandra, arrived, and 3 years after that, their son, Blake, completed the family. The early years of their marriage were filled with love and laughter as they built their life together. The kids were talented and creative, excelling in sports and music. Kimberly was a devoted homemaker, always involved in her Children's Lives serving as head of the PDA and leading their scout troop. Meanwhile, Christopher was building up a small cybersecurity business. After a few years, the family made a big move to Washington state, and by the early 2000s, they settled into a quiet town in Illinois where they bought a big house. This was the time the family was featured in a newspaper for how beautifully they had decorated their home. Now Kimberly was eager to take on something new, so she decided to go after a law degree. She enrolled in a local university, and just a month before the tragedy struck, she earned her law degree. From the outside, their family seemed like the perfect picture of the American dream, right? So if you're wondering what went wrong, well, it turns out that Christopher's job often took him away from home, and during those trips he began an affair with a woman named Jill. This affair went on for about a year before Kimberly found out, and it rocked their marriage to its core. Even though Christopher had betrayed her, they chose to stay together mainly for the kids, but the cracks in their relationship only deepened. Kimberly couldn't shake the feeling that Christopher was still cheating on her, and as it turned out, she wasn't wrong. As if all the emotional stress wasn't enough, Kimberly's health started to suffer too. She began battling severe anxiety, constant migraines, insomnia, and even high blood pressure. It was a lot to handle, and she had no choice but to see a doctor. The medication she was prescribed became a regular part of her life, and for about a year she did her best to manage it all. Additionally, Kimberly attended sessions with a psychologist where she opened up about the growing issues in her marriage. Despite everything she was going through, she remained sociable, friendly, and active. On the other hand, Christopher was described by those close to him as a withdrawn introvert who rarely expressed emotion. Then came June 2007, just before their 13th wedding anniversary. The couple decided to take a family trip to an amusement park in Springfield, Illinois. Christopher picked the destination, and the rest of the family was on board with it. So in the early morning hours of June 14th, the Vaughn family set off in their SUV, but only a few hours later Christopher was found bloodied wandering along the highway by a passing motorist. He had a wound on his leg and in a calm tone claimed that his wife had shot him, but that's where his story got strange. He couldn't recall anything more, blaming a sudden lapse in memory. According to Christopher, they had been on their way to the amusement park when Kimberly started feeling carsick and asked him to stop. He pulled over to the side of the road and stepped out to check the roof rack. That's when he said he heard a gunshot and everything went black. When he came to, he saw blood running down his leg, and in a state of shock ran away, not knowing what had happened to his wife and children. He was picked up by a passerby and still couldn't remember where the SUV had been parked, but when the police found the vehicle, they discovered something horrific inside. Kimberly and their 3 children all shot dead. From the time police got to this startling scene, private investigator Bill Clutter says father and husband Christopher Vaughn was the primary suspect, accused of killing his family and staging it like a murder-suicide. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Kimberly had been shot once in the head, and each of the children had been shot twice, although a witness at the scene recalled Christopher Vaughn saying his wife had pulled the trigger. Vaughn's memory seemed to betray him once he reached the hospital. In fact, when speaking to a nurse, he reportedly said, "You should call my wife, she gets mad when I don't call her." After getting treatment, Vaughn was taken to the police station where he was grilled for almost 14 hours. On June 14th, he came back for 2 more rounds of questioning on June 15th and 17th. During these lengthy interviews, he told investigators he remembered Kimberly asking him to pull over on the frontage road because she was feeling nauseous. He described how he pulled off the road, parked near a cell phone tower, and got out of the car to check the back tires. After securing the strap on the topper, he got back in the car and noticed his leg was bleeding. However, he claimed he had no memory of anyone shooting him or his family. When detectives suggested that perhaps Kimberly had shot him, Christopher immediately defended her, saying there was no way she could have hurt the kids. He stuck to his story, stating that he had only learned about being shot when a doctor told him at the hospital. He seemed genuinely confused, claiming that no one else was around and Kimberly didn't have a gun, so he couldn't understand how it had happened. As the questioning continued, the detectives informed him that his family wasn't dead and asked him to explain what had happened. At that point, Vaughn asked them to bring Kimberly in so he could talk to her directly. Throughout the entire process, he repeatedly denied being involved in the deaths, insisting that he had no memory of the horrific events, but soon after he would also claim that it was Kimberly who shot him. This shift in his story only added to the confusion, making it harder to believe his version of the tragic events. Initially, many people defended Christopher, believing he couldn't possibly have committed such a horrific act. They speculated that someone else might have been involved. However, the police, who had seen the crime scene firsthand, were convinced that the murders were domestic in nature, and dismissed the idea of any other suspects. During further interrogations, Christopher couldn't recall any new details but stuck to his story, insisting that Kimberly might have been the one to kill their children, wound him, and then take her own life. He attributed her actions to the medications she had been taking and the tension in their relationship due to his infidelity. He explained his memory loss by claiming it was a result of shock, which also accounted for why he hadn't immediately contacted the authorities or emergency services. Despite his unconvincing explanations, there wasn't enough evidence to arrest Christopher right away. The police continued their investigation, seizing the couple's laptops and searching the family's home. While the preliminary investigation was underway, Christopher remained free, even going so far as to organize the funeral for his wife and children. The funeral, scheduled for June 23, took place at a local funeral home. A large crowd gathered and many attendees noticed the palpable tension between the Vaughn and Phillips families. Just as the funeral service was about to begin, a police car arrived and Christopher was arrested on charges of murdering his family. He remained calm, going with the officers without resistance. However, his parents were furious, arguing that their son wasn't even allowed to say goodbye to his family while Christopher's guilt had not been proven. The extensive media coverage of the case led the Vaughn family to believe that his arrest at the funeral was a deliberate move to garner even more public attention. Meanwhile, the Phillips family welcomed the arrest. Kimberly's mother expressed a sense of relief, saying she was glad her daughter had been cleared of suspicion in the deaths of her children. From the outset, investigators had been skeptical of Christopher's account. He consistently attributed his lack of recollection to a sudden memory lapse, all while insisting that his wife was responsible for the horrific crime. He even considered himself fortunate that the bullet had only grazed the soft tissue of his thigh, avoiding any major blood vessels. But as the investigation unfolded, it was revealed that Christopher had taken out a life insurance policy on Kimberly, one that would entitle him to a $1 million payout in the event of her death. The deeper the police dug, the more convinced they became that Christopher was the primary suspect in this terrible tragedy. The investigation spanned over 5 years, and during this time Christopher remained in custody. Despite his repeated claims of innocence, he faced a slew of serious charges, and if convicted he could have been sentenced to death. Under state law, he was provided with attorneys funded by a special program offering legal defense to those facing capital punishment. Christopher's defense team worked tirelessly to shift the blame onto his late wife Kimberly. They presented evidence suggesting that Kimberly had suffered from various mental health issues made worse by the marital crisis caused by Christopher's infidelity and her subsequent health problems. They argued that the medication she had been prescribed only worsened her condition, ultimately leading to her tragic actions. Now, this whole thing might not be as far-fetched as it sounds, especially if you consider the perspective of Robert Deal, a crime scene investigator who worked on the case. Deal has openly supported Christopher Vaughn, arguing that the bullet's path and other forensic evidence actually point to Kimberly being the shooter. He believes that investigators had tunnel vision, only focusing on one theory without considering other possibilities. According to Deal, whenever he tried to suggest something that went against the official narrative, he wasn't taken seriously. He felt like every time he had an idea that didn't fit with what the police were saying, they just brushed him off, claiming that Christopher Vaughn was a criminal mastermind who could outsmart everyone, even the experts. Deal said they would change their theory of what happened to try to match the evidence, instead of letting the evidence guide them to the truth. The defense team also pointed out that some key pieces of the forensic case didn't hold up under scrutiny. For instance, the state argued that Christopher unbuckled his wife's seatbelt after shooting her, claiming a large blood stain near the latch came from Kimberly's wound, but when DNA tests were done, it was revealed that the blood actually belonged to Christopher, not Kimberly. What's even more telling is a transfer stain found on Kimberly's right thumb, which suggests that she might have unbuckled her seatbelt after Christopher was shot. This little piece of evidence made the state's theory look pretty shaky. The defense didn't stop there. They also highlighted that at the time of her death, Kimberly was taking medications like Nipoline and Topamax for her migraine headaches. A year after her death, the FDA released a report that showed a significant risk of suicide linked to both of these drugs. Kimberly herself had even mentioned in an email to Christopher just 2 weeks before her death that she'd noticed a big personality change and increased anxiety in herself. To make matters more complicated, her noradrenaline levels were found to be at the low end of the toxic range, suggesting that the medication might have been messing with her mood and behavior. The defense theorized that these drugs could have made her behave in ways that were out of character, potentially even leading to self-harm or homicidal thoughts. The defense also suggested that Christopher could have suffered from something called dissociative amnesia. This condition, which can happen after a person experiences something traumatic, could explain why he had no memory of the tragic events that occurred. Even Dr. Todd Grande, a professional counselor who specializes in personality disorders, addiction, trauma recovery, psychopathology and assessments, pointed out that cases like this aren't exactly rare. According to him, it's actually possible for people to lose their memory following a specific traumatic event like an accident. The argument of the defense was that Chris had memory loss, and it could be explained by a disorder called dissociative amnesia. This is a type of amnesia that can occur around the events of a trauma. I've seen this many times. I don't have any doubt that it's a real condition. For example, it happens once in a while with severe motor vehicle accidents. The argument of the defense was that Chris had memory loss, and it could be explained by a disorder called dissociative amnesia. This kind of memory loss, known as dissociative amnesia, can occur when someone goes through something so traumatic that their mind essentially blocks out the event to protect them from the emotional pain. So while it might seem unusual, it's not completely unheard of for someone to forget details of a major incident, especially when it's tied to trauma. At this point, things were finally starting to look up for Christopher in his case, but just as hope seemed to be on his side, a big change occurred. The state passed new laws that abolished the death penalty. This meant Christopher lost the legal team that had been funded by the Capital Defense Program. His defense team asked for a hefty $250,000 to continue their work, but Christopher simply couldn't afford it. As a result, he was given a public defender and they had to start from scratch, completely reworking his defense. Unfortunately for Christopher, this new defense team couldn't make a strong case, and things took a turn when investigators dug into his personal laptop, which had been seized during a search of his home. What they found was a huge stash of messages between Christopher and a Canadian man named Steve. The two had met about 10 months before the tragedy on a social networking site, and they'd been in regular contact ever since. Christopher opened up to Steve about how unhappy he was in his marriage. He admitted he was tired of family life and dreamed of running away to the wilderness far from everything. They even discussed survival skills, camping and living off the grid in remote areas like forests, deserts and mountains. At one point Christopher tried to convince Steve to help him fake his death so he could escape his family and so that Kimberly could collect the insurance. When Steve refused, Christopher said he would leave anyway, quitting his job and city life to disappear into the Canadian wilderness where no one would be able to find him. Interestingly, about a month before the tragedy, Christopher started mentioning a woman named Maya. He claimed he was in love with her and planned to take her with him when he made his escape. Police tracked down Maya and it turned out she was a dancer at a local strip club that Christopher regularly visited. The two had dated for a few months, and during that time Christopher often complained about his unhappy family life. He even suggested they run away together, but Maya thought the idea was ridiculous and turned him down. To make matters worse, it also came out that Christopher had been involved with another young dancer. He had lied to her, claiming he was single and childless, trying to impress her in an attempt to start a new life. Christopher even spent a significant amount of money and even proposed they run away to another country together. With all these new revelations, Christopher could no longer escape the mounting evidence, especially with his defense team now drastically changed. The trial of Christopher Vaughn began in the fall of 2012 and quickly became a media sensation. During the proceedings, damning evidence came to light. Christopher had bought a gun just before the tragic event and had been practicing at shooting ranges multiple times, including the night before the family trip. Forensic experts confirmed that the bullet wound on Christopher's thigh was inflicted at nearly point-blank range, which directly contradicted his claim that Kimberly shot him while he was outside the car and she was inside. Another pivotal piece of evidence came from the blood stains found on Christopher's clothing. Prosecutors argued that if Christopher had truly exited the car before any violence occurred, there would be no way for his wife's or children's blood to have ended up on his clothes. Even more damning, Kimberly's blood wasn't found on the murder weapon or on her hands, something that would have been impossible if she had shot herself in the head instead. Investigators discovered a drop of Christopher's blood on Kimberly's thumb, suggesting she had been in close contact with him after he was injured. Further investigations into Christopher's work computer revealed even more incriminating evidence. He had researched detailed methods for staging a crime scene. This discovery painted a clear picture further implicating him in the brutal murders of his wife and children. Kimberly's physician also played a critical role in the trial, providing testimony that Kimberly, despite being prescribed medication for insomnia, headaches and high blood pressure, had never shown any signs of desire to harm herself or others. Even with the defense's attempts to counter the evidence, the jury ultimately found Christopher Vaughn guilty on all counts, convicting him for the horrific murders of his entire family. Christopher Vaughn was sentenced to 4 life sentences, one for each of his family members, without the possibility of parole. However, shortly after receiving this harsh sentence, Vaughn made a surprising statement. He claimed that he suddenly remembered the events of that tragic day in great detail and that he had never actually lost his memory. According to his new account, the gunshots rang out after he exited the car. Initially he was confused about what was happening, but then he saw the bodies of his children. At that moment he said his wife shot him in the leg, shouting that everything was his fault before turning the gun on herself. This new testimony was dismissed as absurd and had no impact on the verdict. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Christopher's parents continued to fight to clear his name in the court of public opinion. For years they appeared on talk shows, gave interviews and maintained blogs and social media accounts where they portrayed their son as a victim of an unhappy marriage. They also blamed Kimberly's family, insisting that her relatives never accepted Christopher and made his life miserable from the very beginning. The Vaughn family filed Multiple petitions for clemency hoping to have Christopher acquitted or his sentence reduced. Several of these petitions were addressed to the state governor, who after reviewing the case declared that he had no reason to doubt the fairness of the court's decision. The governor emphasized that the murder of one's family is one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, and in this case there would be no leniency or justification. With all that being said, do you think Christopher is the killer? According to official reports, the shot in his thigh was just an inch away from his genitals, which could have been a life-threatening blow, but then there's the fact that he seemed to want to escape to the wilderness without his wife, which could definitely be seen as a potential motive. Story 4. The terrible scene. The worst I've ever seen in my life. She fought like a real hero for her kids. They were doing their homework when they got murdered. They were stacked on top of one another and the tub was full of water. You can't drown children while you stare into their gasping faces without being the devil. The devil wouldn't even come close to describing the evil behind this case. It was something far darker beyond what words can capture. On November 20, 2010, a frantic call from a neighbor of the Peters family set everything in motion. The mother of 3 hadn't been answering her phone, and when police arrived for a welfare check, they stepped into what can only be described as a living nightmare. Blood painted the walls and the scene screamed of a violent, uncontrolled rage, a massacre that shook even the most seasoned investigators. As horrifying as the crime was, justice wouldn't come swiftly. It would take 9 agonizing years to uncover the truth, and the answer lay disturbingly close to home. Someone trusted, someone familiar. But who could carry out such an unspeakable act, and what could have driven them to it? Before we dive into the shocking details, let's take a moment to get to know the Peters family, an incredibly close-knit group of 4. At the heart of it all is the gorgeous Brandy Peters, born on Valentine's Day, February 14, 1983 in Bainbridge, Georgia. The youngest of 8 children, Brandy grew up with 3 brothers and 4 sisters before her family eventually relocated to Tallahassee, Florida, where she graduated from Godby High School. From a young age, Bry's natural flair for hairstyling was evident, and this is a talent she proudly inherited from her mother. The skill helped her build a thriving home-based hair business where she created stunning, one-of-a-kind hairstyles that kept her clients coming back for more. But Brandy wasn't just a businesswoman. She loved spending her time crocheting and enjoying the company of her loved ones. One of her closest relationships was with her cousin Janet Howard. They were more like sisters than cousins, with personalities that balanced fiery energy and calmness. But in 2003, Bry's life took a major turn when she found out she was pregnant with twins Tama and Tanya with her then boyfriend Antonio. However, their relationship was shaken when Antonio was incarcerated, leaving Brandy to raise the girls on her own. But she wasn't alone in this. Her family, especially her mother and sister Monica, stepped in to offer their unwavering support. However, it didn't take long for Brandy to find love again with Henry Segura, a hard-working welder, and together they built a new life. In 2007 they welcomed their son Javant into the world. With this new addition, Brandy and her 3 kids moved into a cozy home in Saddle Creek Run, a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood. It was the perfect place to settle down, close to schools and not far from the buzzing college scene in Tallahassee. It felt like the fresh start Brandy and her kids needed. So as you can imagine, everything seemed perfect when you first heard about Bry's life, right? The kids were doing well, the family was happy, and there was even a Thanksgiving trip planned to visit her cousin Janet in Tampa. But here's where the story takes a tragic turn. On the evening of November 20, 2010, things started to go off track. Janet and Bry's family began to get really worried. Brandy hadn't picked up her phone, and that wasn't like her at all. As a home-based hairstylist, staying connected with clients was pretty much a must. Picking up the phone wasn't even optional. After multiple attempts to reach her and getting no answer, her family decided it was time to take action. They called the police for a welfare check, hoping to get some answers about what was going on, but what they uncovered would change everything in a way no one was prepared for. Breaking news out of northern Florida: a mother and her young children were found killed at a violent crime scene. Now homicide detectives are looking for whoever might have had a reason to harm them. Tallahassee police say the four were murdered at a home on Saddle Creek Run Road. Police say the children are 6-year-old twins and a 3-year-old boy. They have not released any information on who they are or how they died, but they say they are actively searching the area. The home is just a few miles from the campuses of Florida State University and Florida A&M University. After hours of investigation, the detectives could tell that Brandy had fought for her life. There were trails of blood leading to the door where her body was found. It looked like she'd almost made it out, but then she was dragged back inside and beaten to death with a blunt object after being shot multiple times. The brutality of it all was chilling, but the horrors didn't stop there. When investigators went further into the house, they made another devastating discovery. Bry's children were found in the bathroom, stacked on top of each other in the bathtub. The tub was filled with water. Sadly, Brandy and Tama had been shot while Tanya and Javant had been drowned. It appeared that the killer then placed Tama in the tub with her siblings as though to add to the horror of it all. The signs of a struggle were everywhere. According to the police, the scene was even more gruesome than anyone could have imagined. The walls and ceilings were tainted with blood everywhere. It was clear that the violence had been intense, and the house itself was a chaotic mess, and you could tell Brandy fought desperately to protect her children, but in the end her efforts weren't enough. There were no signs of a robbery, though it wasn't about taking anything. Brandy didn't have much to steal, and the door wasn't even broken down. In fact, it was locked when the police arrived, making it seem like the attack had been carefully planned, carried out swiftly in the evening, likely just hours before they were discovered. The children had been wearing their pajamas with their homework still out, suggesting they were just about to settle down for the night. They had no idea that someone, perhaps even more than one person, had slipped into their home, and to make things even worse, the phone had been ripped off the wall, its cord severed. It was as though the killer had taken every step to ensure that no one could call for help. It wasn't just a random act of violence. This was a carefully calculated, horrific plan. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Now, if you're wondering who could orchestrate something so brutal, well, let's break it down. As mentioned, there were no signs of forced entry, meaning this was undoubtedly a personal attack. The family likely knew the killer, someone they trusted or at least didn't see as a threat. One person who was closely connected to the family was Henry Segura, the father of little Giovanni. He was interviewed and spoke with authorities the very day the bodies were found, and his role in all this would soon become a key part of the investigation. As it turns out, things weren't all rainbows and sunshine for Henry and Brandy after they met. At the time, Henry was already married to someone else, and his relationship with Brandy was more of a fling until she got pregnant. However, when the investigation turned to him, Henry had an alibi. He was interviewed and he claimed that at the time of the murders he was at home with his wife. His cell phone records supported this claim, and his wife confirmed his story. When questioned further, Henry described Brandy as spunky, sweet and cool, saying they didn't have any bad blood between them. He seemed to paint the picture of a relationship that was friendly and casual, which only made the whole situation more perplexing. During this same interview, Henry did something that seemed to further distance him from suspicion. He asked the detective how his son Javant had been killed. To many, this question felt like the action of someone who wasn't guilty. Henry also shared how he and Brandy met, saying it happened about 4 years earlier at a gas station in Tallahassee. At that time, Henry admitted that his wife didn't know about their relationship, but according to him, Brandy didn't seem to mind that he was married. However, other sources painted a slightly different picture. At the time of their fling, Henry and his wife were reportedly on bad terms and not even living together. This complicated dynamic made it seem like Brandy wasn't necessarily stepping into a happy marriage but rather a messy situation where lines were already blurred. But here's where things take a twist. During the interview, the detective noticed something odd. There were slight scratch marks on Henry's pinky finger. This raised immediate red flags. The officer asked Henry if he'd be willing to show more of his body, and upon inspection there were additional red marks. When officers questioned Henry about the marks on his body, he had an explanation ready. He claimed they were from a gang fight in Tallahassee, adding that he had even been shot in the stomach during the incident. To further prove he had nothing to hide, Henry confidently volunteered his DNA for testing. His calm demeanor and willingness to cooperate seemed to steer suspicion away from him, but there was one detail that couldn't be ignored. Henry admitted he had doubts about being Gervonta's biological father. He explained that he was skeptical about whether Gervonta was truly his son, and even mentioned being under a court order to pay child support. Despite this, Henry insisted that his relationship with Brandy was nothing but positive. He described her as a caring mother and claimed they had always been on good terms with no animosity between them, and according to him, on the day of the murder he was nowhere near Bry's house. He firmly insisted that he hadn't been there at all. However, he did admit to visiting Brandy just 2 days before the horrific incident. He claimed that was the last time he had any contact with her, standing by his story with unwavering confidence. Still, those doubts about Devon's paternity couldn't be overlooked. Was it possible that frustration over child support or lingering uncertainty had caused tension beneath the surface? Or was Henry truly the cooperative, innocent figure he appeared to be? The community was desperate for answers. People were terrified, urging officers to move quickly, because what if this was the work of a serial killer? After all, Tallahassee had a dark history of housing some of the most notorious criminals, including the infamous Ted Bundy and Gary Michael Hilton, both of whom had ties to the area. With the weight of the community's fear on their shoulders, the investigators turned their focus to the crime scene itself, combing every inch of Bry's home for clues. What they found raised even more questions. Inside the house, investigators stumbled upon something that added a new layer of mystery to the case: a stack of love letters. But these weren't your typical roses are red, violets are blue kind of notes. These letters were allegedly from James Carlos Santos, a well-known drug dealer with a notorious reputation in Tallahassee. Now, Santos wasn't just any guy. He was currently behind bars and claimed to have some serious ties to criminal organizations. From his prison cell, Santos made bold and chilling claims that immediately grabbed the detectives' attention. According to him, he was a key figure in a powerful criminal network, and Brandy Peters had been running drugs for him. But here's where things took a darker turn. Santos alleged that Brandy had been skimming cocaine from his operation, and once he discovered this betrayal, he claimed to have ordered her and her entire family to be killed. And Santos didn't stop there. He had receipts, or so he claimed. He pointed to letters and emails he'd sent to Brandy, even proposing marriage to her. In his mind, they had some kind of relationship, maybe even something serious. But when detectives dug a little deeper, the cracks in his story began to show. Turns out this relationship was completely one-sided. Brandy wasn't romantically involved with Santos at all. What was also really interesting about Carlos Santos was that when investigators interviewed him and asked if he remembered any physical traits of Brandy, he struggled. In fact, he had a hard time recalling anything specific about her appearance at all. You would think that if he had been involved with her, especially in such a serious and shady way, he'd be able to describe her clearly, but instead he gave vague answers as though he couldn't even picture her face. It didn't take long for detectives to realize Santos wasn't the reliable source he tried to portray himself as. In fact, they uncovered a long history of him making over-the-top claims about crimes he didn't commit, and it wasn't just detectives who were skeptical. A psychiatrist evaluated Santos and confirmed what they suspected. He was delusional and a pathological liar. Basically, Santos was living in a fantasy world and his bold claims were more fiction than fact. However, the investigation didn't stop with Santos' false claims. In fact, it opened up more leads thanks to the potential link to drug dealing. One of the most promising came from DNA found on the phone cord at the crime scene. This DNA was flagged as a possible match to a convicted drug smuggler living in Italy, a man who was suspected to be deeply involved with a notorious drug cartel. The connection seemed like it could be the break investigators needed, but here's the twist: when authorities reached out to this individual, instead of playing hard to get or going into hiding, he fully cooperated. He agreed to meet FBI agents at the U.S. Embassy in Rome and voluntarily handed over a DNA sample. This kind of openness suggested he wasn't involved, and indeed his DNA didn't match the evidence at the crime scene. To cover all bases, the DNA was compared to 4 other individuals from the national database, but none of them were a match. This lead, like many others, turned out to be a dead end. However, the drug angle didn't just stop with this one lead. It had already put the investigation in a different direction, sparking other possible connections. It kept pushing the investigators forward, even though it didn't ultimately solve the case. The discovery of the spade shovel at the crime scene had people speculating it might be a cartel's calling card, but once again this theory fell apart. Why would a cartel leave a spade shovel when a simple ace of spades would have been easier to carry and much less obvious? Another thing that had the detectives so confused about this case was that there was another informant who came forward claiming that he was involved in the murders. This informant, Gregory Washington, told the police that Dario Paramore had confessed to him that he, along with someone named Haywood Griffin, had carried out the brutal killings, but Griffin quickly denied any involvement and the police didn't push the investigation into Paramore any further. Prosecutors argued that the conversation didn't actually qualify as a confession, so they dismissed it. But this wasn't the only wild theory. A lot of the so-called jailhouse snitches came forward with their own claims about the case, but many of them were suspected of just trying to cut deals to get their sentences reduced. In fact, one even admitted to asking for a lighter sentence in exchange for his tips with the cartel hit theory, and the claims from jailhouse snitches pretty much squashed, and no solid leads coming from the drug connection. The investigation shifted its focus back to the who were much closer to the victims. The father of the twin girls, Tamaya and Tanaya, was briefly considered as a suspect in the case. However, given that he was incarcerated at the time of the murders, authorities quickly ruled him out. Multiple sources did reveal, though, that he was devastated by the news of the killings, even though he hadn't been able to form many memories with the to his situation. It was clear that he wasn't involved, but the heartbreak was still there. That left only one remaining suspect who had both the motive and opportunity: Henry Segura. He was actually interviewed again 10 days after the murders, and this time the prosecutors were determined to push him until he cracked. It turns out that Henry owed Brandy a massive $20,000 in unpaid child support. According to the detectives, the only way Henry could see to get out of this financial mess was either to go to jail for not paying or to eliminate the problem altogether, and in his mind that meant getting rid of Brandy and Giovanni. The prosecution's theory was chilling: if Brandy died, Henry wouldn't have to worry about paying child support for their son Giovanni. However, if Giovanni had been the one to die instead of Brandy, Henry would still be stuck with the child support payments. So in Henry's twisted logic, Brandy and the child had to go, and according to the prosecutors, the two twin girls were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The girls were supposed to be at their grandmother's house, but when Henry showed up at the house, they became part of the tragic scene. They were innocent victims of Henry's brutal plan. In the second round of questioning, Henry really started to lose his cool when the detectives told him they had spoken with some of his girlfriends to dig into his background. He got furious. It was as if he knew the walls were closing in on him and he was starting to panic. Now you might remember that Henry had previously used his phone to prove that he was home on the day of the murders, but what he didn't tell the detectives was that he had another phone. One that he didn't mention at all. At first Henry lied and said he wasn't anywhere near Bry's house that day, but when the investigators uncovered the secret phone, the GPS data from that phone put him right at the crime scene. That was a game changer. The evidence was there and it couldn't be ignored, so Henry finally changed his story. He admitted that he had been at Bry's house that day, but here's where things get even weirder. He claimed that he wasn't there to kill her. Instead, he said he was there to have sex with her, and he didn't want to admit it at first because he was afraid his wife would find out. After that intense interview, Henry Segura was officially labeled as the prime suspect in the murder of Brandy Peters and her 3 children, but as expected, he wasn't going to go down without a fight. Henry quickly hired a top-notch lawyer who was more than capable of trying to spin the story in his favor, and it wasn't until a year later that Henry was finally arrested after fleeing to Lasser County, Minnesota following the murders. It took a year because the investigation had hit several dead ends, including the whole drug cartel theory, which ultimately led to nothing. When the trial finally kicked off, Henry's defense team tried to argue that the lack of his DNA at the crime scene was solid proof that he wasn't involved in the murders. They even claimed that he had just been there for a casual visit with Brandy. Nothing more, nothing sinister. When Henry was asked why he had lied to the police during his initial interviews, he simply said, "And yet you're asking this jury to believe everything you have to say to them?" Yes. Because in the process of me lying and doing all these lines, I had a whole lot of time to sit down and think about all the mistakes I made, all the kids I had outside of my marriage, and I've learned how to right my wrongs. The case quickly took a turn when Kelsey Kennard, Henry's former cellmate in an Oklahoma jail, came forward to testify. Kennard shocked everyone by revealing that Henry had confessed to him back in 2011. According to Kennard, Henry had gone into disturbing detail about the murders, about how he killed Brandy and her 2 daughters. Despite this bombshell testimony and all the mounting evidence, the jury just couldn't reach a consensus. After hours of deliberation, the jury ended up in a deadlock with an 8-4 vote in favor of acquittal. With no unanimous decision, the judge had no choice but to declare a mistrial. In 2017, the last trial took place in November of 2019. Nearly a decade after the horrific murders, Henry Segura was finally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the trial, the defense tried to argue that a drug cartel was behind the killings, but the jury wasn't convinced. Despite Segura's insistence on his innocence, the evidence against him was overwhelming. His DNA was found at the crime scene and his statements kept changing. All of this pointed to him being the killer. As for Henry, he didn't show much emotion. He quietly spoke with his lawyer and nodded to his family, but one of his family members couldn't keep it together and screamed in the courtroom. She was quickly escorted out by bailiffs who threatened to arrest her. It's chilling to think it took so many years before justice was finally served, and all we can do now is hope that Brandy and her kids are at peace. Story 5. On March 1, 1976, William Bradford Bishop Jr., a star employee of the United States Foreign Service, viciously bludgeoned to death his wife Annette Catherine Weiss, his mother Loelia Amorilis St. Germain, and his 3 sons, 14-year-old William, 10-year-old Brendan, and 5-year-old Jeffrey. It was a murder that no one saw coming, one that had no apparent motive, and a culprit with no history of violence that seemingly vanished into thin air after killing his whole family. What could have compelled this well-respected, well-liked professional to do something so utterly brutal today? We're going to piece together a timeline of his life and reconstruct the night of the murders to attempt to answer that question and look into a recent groundbreaking revelation that completely changed the nature of the case. But first we must take a look at the man Bishop was before he became a monster. Bishop was born on the 1st of August 1936 to Loyola Amarilla Street Germain and William Bradford Bishop Sr. His family was well off by all accounts, which meant that Bishop had the perfect childhood in the beautiful city of Pasadena. A wealthy family meant that Bishop had strong connections and access to amazing opportunities no one else would have had from the get-go. However, it also made him feel like he needed to prove himself. Families with generational wealth expect each generation to grow the family fortune. Bishop grew upper middle class and he'd be obsessed with maintaining this image for the rest of his life. Of course, he had every chance to obtain the skills required to stay in the upper crust. A naturally intelligent and talented boy, Bishop showed an immediate knack for learning languages. He seemed to have a keen interest in studying other cultures, something that would set him up nicely for a career in the Foreign Service. By the time he graduated from South Pasadena High School, everyone expected great things from the young Bishop. Not only was he an exceptional student, he was athletic and charismatic too, making him seem like a natural-born leader. The fact that he cut a striking figure at over 6 feet tall also added to his magnetism, but beneath the mask of a seemingly perfect young man simmered an obsessiveness that only the people closest to him ever saw. Bishop was a perfectionist to an almost pathological degree. The same drive that helped him climb the ranks in the Foreign Service made him quick to anger, and it very likely sent him into a homicidal rage on the night of the incident. Now, there was no sign of this uncontrollably violent Bishop when he graduated from Yale in 1959, or at least no one that knew him in passing would say that he was the violent sort. Perhaps the only person that had caught glimpses of the real Bishop was the woman he married a few months after his college graduation, Annette Catherine Weiss. Not much is known about Annette's early life, but we can confirm that she met Bishop in high school as a freshman. It's possible that she was immediately smitten by the athletic, charismatic junior, and the two began dating not long after they met. Those that knew Annette have all said that she wasn't quite like her extroverted husband, where he preferred to go out and expand his social network. Annette preferred to stay at home and look after the children. She was a quiet sort of girl when Bishop met her, and there's a chance that he saw her as someone that wouldn't question his authority. Of course, it turned out that Annette wouldn't simply accept a lot of the troubling behavior she'd notice over the course of her marriage, but on the day of their wedding in 1959, those tense days were still far ahead in the future. We can say one thing about Annette for sure: she loved children. She was a soft, compassionate, kind-hearted woman with an uncanny ability to understand what a child wants. That's probably what made her such a good mother. It's likely that she had an uncanny ability to soothe the rowdy, uncooperative child. One can imagine that she had to use this talent to calm her easily irritated husband down on more than a few occasions. Anyone that could have shed some light on their marriage is long dead. All we have is witness testimony and other evidence to reconstruct the life they lead. But there's one irrefutable fact about Bishop that only came out quite recently: he cheated on Annette, possibly with multiple other women, and as it turns out, this detail would be crucial in reviving interest in his case decades down the line. But regardless, those first few years were reportedly quite happy for the new couple. As high school sweethearts, they represented what true love could look like, at least if we observe the surface and ignore all the rest. After marrying Annette, Bishop got to work building the legacy he'd always wanted. He spoke 4 languages apart from English, namely Italian, French, Spanish, and Serbo-Croatian, and had a genuine passion for immersing himself in other cultures. With his background as a Yale man, these qualities made him a shoo-in for counterintelligence. He joined the Army's 3rd Military Intelligence Battalion. Not long after his wedding, which led to him being stationed in Italy. It must have been a dream for the young Annette to be living in Europe. Unlike Bishop, she'd grown up middle class, and it's entirely possible that she'd never been out of the country before. Over the next 4 years, Bishop gained a reputation as a reliable soldier, with some sources saying he rose up the ranks and was awarded several medals before being honorably discharged. In 1963, by this point, Bishop had already seen the world and handled top secret documents. He had a proven track record of being able to handle himself on foreign soil. The logical next step for the glory-hungry Bishop was to join the Foreign Service, and that's exactly what he did. His first son, William III, was born about 2 years before his discharge. In 1966, Annette gave birth to another boy, Brendan, and the growing family continued to stay in Italy as Bishop was transferred to Verona, Milan, and eventually Florence. About a year after the birth of his third son, Geoffrey, Bishop was told that he and his family would be moving to Africa for his next posting. Now, this might have been because Bishop had acquired a master's in African Studies from UCLA before his first Foreign Service posting, but it's possible that Bishop saw this as a step down. He was apparently critical in improving trade relations during his postings in Ethiopia and Botswana, but could he have felt slighted by being forced to move to Africa? The cities he lived in, Addis Ababa and Gaborone, are now cultural hubs with well-developed infrastructure, but things might have been different in the 70s. Ethiopia and Botswana were still struggling with rapidly growing populations and reconciling their recent independence from colonial powers at the time. While Bishop may have loved being in the middle of the action during a tumultuous period in Africa's history, his obsession with appearances may have warped his reaction to this development, but whether he saw it that way or not, Bishop's career was moving along nicely. In 1974, he was promoted to assistant chief in the Division of Special Activities and Commercial Treaties and asked to come work at the State Department's DC headquarters. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Bishop was not the type of person who liked to sit behind a desk. From the very beginning, it was clear that he wanted to be off abroad, immersed in a new culture where he could flex his knowledge of languages. Whether or not the move to Africa disturbed him, having to come back to Washington may have been even worse. This is all speculation, of course, but one can imagine that a person like Bishop would become a ticking time bomb over the course of the next 2 years. What he wanted more than anything else was to maintain his upper middle class lifestyle, and with the kids growing up in William Jr. approaching college age, Bishop felt that his career needed to maintain that exponential growth he'd seen early on. Unfortunately, things were not shaping up how he'd hoped. After his promotion to assistant division chief, Bishop waited and waited for a promotion that never came. He'd moved his family into a home in Bethesda, Maryland, and his return to America meant that his mother Loelia could come stay with them as well. Raising 3 kids isn't easy, and Annette must have been happy for the help. How Bishop felt about it we may never know, but based on how things ended, it's possible that he resented his mother's presence in his home. Sources suggest that Loelia frequently criticized Bishop for his lack of career progress. Day by day the tension grew. Financial difficulties started seeping into their lives. Bishop's government salary just wasn't paying the bills as easily as it used to, and it's possible that he had to rely on his mother for financial support. This would have felt absolutely emasculating to a man like Bishop. His colleagues report that he'd become quite irritable in the office. He talked about how he was getting passed over for promotions he deserved, and he seemed to blame everyone for this but himself. There was a sort of belief that Bishop held, a belief that he was better than everyone else and deserved to get to the top as fast as possible. Making assistant division chief at 38 years old might not have seemed that impressive to him. Perhaps he thought that he should have achieved More after over a decade in the Foreign Service, all of these things likely played in his mind as his thoughts slowly drifted towards homicide, along with a few other factors that only came to light much later. An analysis of Bishop's personal diary revealed that he had a lot on his mind during his 2-year stint in D.C. He complained of having trouble sleeping, for which his psychiatrist reportedly prescribed him the sedative called Seroquel, which didn't seem to be working, or at the very least it wasn't really helping him go to sleep at night. It bears mentioning that missing a few doses of a benzodiazepine like Seroquel can cause serious and sudden mood swings. It can cause severe agitation, which can be made even worse by pre-existing difficulties in life. Since the Seroquel didn't seem to be affecting his insomnia, it's possible that Bishop stopped taking it and ended up becoming emotionally volatile in the aftermath, with sleepless nights taking their toll. Bishop also talked about suffering from chronic depression. This too was something that medication failed to resolve. Other events in his life also contributed to the emotional storm that was brewing inside him, a storm that would take him to the most brutally violent depths imaginable. For one thing, some reports suggest that there was an IRS audit on the horizon. This means that there were major financial irregularities in Bishop's tax filings, which must have added fuel to the fire of his personal life. Between his mother's constant criticism about how he wasn't moving up the ranks and his own frustration at being stuck behind a desk, Bishop likely wanted to escape however he could. He set his sights on a possible promotion that would send him back abroad, but this created further tension with his wife. Annette didn't want to keep traveling. She wasn't like Bishop in that respect, and there's also a chance that his controlling nature made it difficult for her to actually enjoy being in a different country. It's been reported that she'd started studying art at the University of Maryland, something that Bishop was very unhappy about. He wanted Annette to be a stay-at-home mom to look after the kids while he went off and played the hero in the Foreign Service, with her youngest child now 5 and her oldest fast approaching adulthood. Annette might have been looking forward to taking a less hands-on role as a parent and doing something for herself for a change. The presence of Loelia also made this a possibility, but this meant that Bishop's control over his family was slipping. There's perhaps nothing else that a pathological control freak fears more. And then on March 1, 1976, he found out that the promotion he so craved, the promotion that he hoped would fix everything, had gone to someone else. All hope of escaping the desk life, an increase in his salary, and proving himself to his mother evaporated shortly after hearing the bad news. Bishop told his secretary that he wasn't feeling well and that he'd be heading home early. On his way home, he made a stop and purchased the tools he would soon use to murder his family. The last time anyone saw Bishop was outside the State Department building in D.C.'s Foggy Bottom neighborhood. His colleague Roy Harrell reported that Bishop seemed agitated but saw nothing to suggest that he was out for blood. Bishop's movements aren't clear after leaving his office, but police know that he emptied out his bank account at some point. The reported amount ranges from a few hundred to a few thousand, but either way, this just shows how little Bishop had to his name. After withdrawing the cash, Bishop likely headed to a mall in Bethesda where he purchased a ball and peen hammer and a gas tank. He then went to the gas station next door and filled up his car tank as well as the spare tank he just bought. After which he visited a hardware store and bought a shovel and a pitchfork. He arrived at home between 7:30 and 8:00. That evening, hammer in hand, police were able to determine that he killed his wife first. She might have been in the kitchen preparing a meal, or perhaps she was in the living room enjoying some downtime after the boys had gone to sleep. Wherever she was when Bishop returned, we know that she was likely in the front hall when she died. Detectives would later find blood in this area along with the upstairs bedrooms. It's possible that she put up a fight, but it's more likely that she never saw the hammer coming. Bishop coldly bashed his wife's brains out and then waited for His next victim to come home, Loelia, happened to be out at the time walking the family dog. Did Bishop time his arrival based on his mother being away? It certainly made it easier for him to kill Annette without causing too much noise, and the way he plotted his subsequent actions indicate that the murders were intricately planned. On the other hand, it's possible that he was just improvising. The violence he committed certainly doesn't indicate that he was of sound mind. Loelia soon came home and met the same fate as her daughter-in-law. Bishop slammed the hammer into his mother's face repeatedly until she died. The boys were asleep this whole time, indicating that Bishop may have killed Loelia after taking the dog elsewhere, otherwise its barking would have woken them up. William Jr. of Brendan and Jeffrey were all in bed when their father walked up the stairs clutching the bloody hammer that he just put through the skulls of his wife and mother. The one comfort we can take from all this is that all three boys were still asleep as Bishop brought the hammer down on them. They died peacefully. Or so we can hope. What does a man do after committing such an evil act? It's impossible to imagine, but in the case of William Bradford Bishop, he acted coolly, calmly and completely without emotion. He took the 5 corpses and placed them in his car, which he then drove nearly 300 miles to North Carolina. The trip would have taken him all night, and by the morning of March 2, Bishop dug his family a shallow grave in a swamp near the town of Columbia, tossed their corpses in, covered them with gasoline and set them ablaze. With the deed now done, Bishop was free to make his getaway. After burying and burning his family's corpses, Bishop headed to Jacksonville, where he bought tennis shoes at a local sporting goods store. This is where the story starts to get more mysterious, because witnesses say that Bishop wasn't alone. He had a dog with him, and some say he was accompanied by a so-called dark-skinned woman. The owner of the store, John Wheatley, stated that the woman looked like she was from somewhere in the Caribbean and that she was wearing an elegant dress. They seemed like a lovely couple to the store owner, who described Bishop as polite and calm. Whether he was with this woman or not, Bishop's next stop was the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, where his car was found on March 18. The witness stated that the car had been there since at least the 5th, indicating that Bishop had driven for 2 or 3 hours a day. As he slowly made his way to the park, once there he joined the sea of hikers walking along the Appalachian Trail and was never seen or heard from again. As Bishop drove to Jacksonville, the smoke created by his family's burning corpses alerted Forest Service workers in the area, and Forest Ranger Ronald Brickhouse was sent to investigate. He found the family's smoldering remains along with a shovel. With 2 corpses reportedly facing each other, their identity remained a mystery until March 10, when a concerned neighbor phoned Bethesda police and informed them that the Bishops had been absent for quite some time. Police arrived and found the blood on the porch, front hall and bedrooms, and soon identified the Bishops' bodies through dental records. By the time Bishop's car was found on March 18, he was long gone. Police tried to track his scent along the Appalachian Trail, but it was no use. He'd always been an athletic man that loved camping outdoors. These skills ended up helping him get a massive head start. Bishop remains at large to this day, with the FBI removing him from their top 10 most wanted list in 2018. He's presumed to either be dead or hiding in plain sight somewhere in the US. Other sightings have placed him in Switzerland and Italy, but none have been confirmed. No one knows for sure why Bishop did what he did. However, in 2021, a new revelation in the case confirmed both Bishop's history of secret extramarital affairs and the identity of a previous unknown child. Kathy Gilchrist was 18 years old when the Bishop family was murdered. In fact, she was being crowned the beauty queen of the small Massachusetts town she called home when Bishop was disappearing into the Smoky Mountains. Why is this relevant to this case? Because she was Bishop's daughter. She'd always known she was adopted, and she only found out about Bishop when she started digging into her past to discover her biological parents. She was born before any of Bishop's other children, but considering she was born a year before the wedding, he was Definitely dating Annette at the time. Not only did this prove that he cheated on Annette multiple times, it also showed that he might have had a motive no one expected had Annette discovered his illegitimate daughter and confronted him. Is that why Bishop killed her and escaped? And what about this mysterious woman that accompanied him during his escape? The answers to these questions may never come to light. Story 6: A jungle that lured them in only to swallow them whole. Two young women vanished without a trace, leaving behind a trail of haunting clues and chilling silence. Was it the wrath of wild nature or something far more sinister hiding in the shadows? A decade later, the truth remains buried in silence, unseen, unanswered, and unwilling to be found. April 1st started like any other sunlit morning in Boquete. Chris and Liz, and both 20-something students with a love for exploration, laced up their hiking boots and set off toward El Pianista, a trail known for its breathtaking views and eerie silence. Some say they had brunch with two Dutch men before the hike. Others recall them bringing along a friendly dog from a local restaurant. Nothing about that morning seemed off, not in the photos Liz and snapped on her Canon PowerS shot camera. The images showed smiles, mountain peaks, and sunlight spilling through the clouds. They looked happy, at peace. Image number 508. The last normal photo showed Chris carefully crossing a stream just after 1 p.m. and then nothing. The plan was simple. Liz and Fern and Chris Kamers, eager to explore the wild beauty of Panama, had arranged to hike the trail with a local guide, but on the eve of their adventure something strange happened. They made an unexpected decision. A day earlier than planned, the two young women set off alone into the jungle without the guide, without anyone to watch over them. Why did they do it? The answer remains a mystery. The next morning their guide arrived at the trailhead expecting to meet the two tourists, but there was no sign of them, no footprints, no trace that they had even started the trail. A sense of unease began to settle in. It wasn't until the following day that the search began, but the clues didn't match the story anyone had expected. Against all logic, two hikers were found on the trail. Liz and Chris were already deep in the wilderness, but how had they gotten there? The answer lay in an unlikely source: a local taxi driver who had dropped them off near the trailhead. And to complicate things further, there were two other men in the vehicle. Who were they, and what role did they play in the women's bizarre journey? As the details unraveled, the story grew stranger. The women, eager and excited to explore, had ventured into one of the most treacherous areas of the jungle, yet they had no map, no compass, no flashlight. They were walking blind into the heart of the unknown with no tools to guide or protect them. And so in the dense, untamed wilderness they began their journey into the dark unknown, unprepared, unaware, and soon to vanish from the world as the jungle swallowed them whole. They didn't come back. No sign of the girls, no message, no movement. Concern spiraled into panic. Texts to Chris' father went unanswered by April 6. Their desperate families were on Panamanian soil, joined by Dutch detectives, trained dogs, and a hefty reward, $30,000 for any trace of Chris and Liz. The jungle was swept, rivers combed, air searched, but there was nothing, not yet. Somewhere past the last smiling photograph, their story took a turn, one that no one saw coming. So what really happened after? Image number 508. What began as a hike through paradise quickly unraveled into a desperate fight for survival. Unbeknownst to early searchers, Chris and Liz had started calling for help just hours after they were last seen. Chris' iPhone tried to reach emergency services, the first of what would become 77 failed attempts. Minutes later, Liz and Samsung followed. Both phones kept trying over the next several days, each call bouncing off the unforgiving silence of the jungle. There were no signals. Then came the photos, the strangest and most unsettling pieces of this tangled puzzle. From Liz Ann's camera, investigators retrieved 133 images. Among them, 90 shots were taken in the dead of night on April 8. Almost all were seemingly random pitch black jungle flashes against leaves, eerie close-ups of rocks, and inexplicable Arrangements: a mirror, strips of plastic, white tissues. One photo stands out like a ghost in the dark. The back of Chris' head slumped slightly forward, taken at 1:49 a.m. Some claim to see blood near her temple, others weren't so sure, but the most disturbing clue was what wasn't there. Photo number 509 missing from the memory card. Were they deleted, corrupted, or something far worse happened that we can never imagine? Whatever happened in that jungle, it wasn't quick and it wasn't simple. The question now wasn't just how they died, but what or who was with them in those final harrowing days. It wasn't until June 14, more than 10 weeks since Chris and Lizen vanished into the rainforest, that the jungle finally gave something back. A local woman stumbled upon a blue backpack near the banks of the Cabra River, far off the main El Pianista trail. Oddly, the bag was dry and clean, untouched by the unforgiving Panamanian rain. Even stranger, locals swore it hadn't been there the day before. Inside, authorities found both women's phones, $88 in cash, sunglasses, 2 bras, and Lizan's camera, almost as if someone had carefully packed it then left it behind on purpose. Closed by Chris. Denim shorts turned up, though whether they were folded neatly on a rock or tossed in disarray depends on who you ask. And then came the remains: a foot still inside a boot, a piece of pelvis, bone fragments strewn along the river's edge. DNA confirmed the worst, it was them. But even in death, the mystery only deepened. Some of Lizan's remains still had bits of skin. Chris' bones, however, looked almost artificial, bleached white, unusually clean, with phosphorus levels that didn't match the environment. No signs of trauma, no cuts, no answers, just a heap of questions piling. As the investigation moved further, the questions only had silence as a response, a silence that grows louder with every unsettling clue. Who placed the backpack so carefully, and why? Why were the bones so drastically different? And what really happened deep in the jungle that April afternoon when 2 bright lives vanished without a sound? The investigation into the disappearance of Chris, Krimmers, and Liz and Fun was anything but straightforward. In the months following their vanishing, Panamanian authorities shifted their theories several times. At first, the case was classified as a possible homicide, then the focus turned toward abduction, with rumors swirling and pressure mounting from both the media and the Dutch government. But by March 2015, nearly a year after the girls vanished, the case was quietly closed. Officials concluded that Chris and Lizen had died as a result of a tragic hiking accident. According to the final report, the treacherous terrain, steep 30 to 40-meter cliffs, and fast, unpredictable river currents were to blame. The ruggedness of the jungle, they said, could easily explain why only scattered remains were found, and why their discovery came weeks apart. Dutch forensic experts who had worked alongside Panamanian teams broadly agreed. They emphasized the dangerous conditions of the rainforest and the likelihood that the girls had gotten lost, injured, and ultimately succumbed to the elements. Their families, after months of agonizing uncertainty, accepted this explanation with heavy hearts. The bodies were flown home to the Netherlands, and Chris and Lizen were finally laid to rest in their memory. A small stone memorial was placed at the Mirador, the scenic viewpoint near the top of El Pianista, where their final smiling photos were taken. But even with the case closed, the public wasn't ready to move on. In fact, the official explanation only sparked more questions. Critics pointed out troubling inconsistencies, beginning with the mysterious appearance of the girl's backpack found along the Calabar River over 10 weeks later. It was strangely dry and clean despite the heavy Panamanian rains. Locals swore it hadn't been there the day before. And of course, there was photo number 509, the missing image from the camera sequence. It didn't appear in the memory card structure, leading some to believe it had been deleted, possibly to hide something. Perhaps most haunting of all were the failed emergency calls made from the girls' phones, spanning days even after one phone had died. The final attempts came after the correct pin was no longer used, hinting that only one girl may have remained alive, or that a third party had gained access to the phone. We will dive deeper into the details of their phones. History next. Each detail chipped away at the idea of a simple accident, inviting speculation and sowing doubt, and as the years passed new theories emerged, each more polarizing than the last, because in this case the facts are real but the truth that might be slightly evident upon the discovery of their phones. And let us tell you, it only gets more bizarre in the days following Chris Kramer's and Liz and Fun's disappearance. Investigators clung to every fragment of information they could recover, and what they found inside two phones, a white iPhone 4 and a black Samsung Galaxy S3, would become one of the most haunting aspects of the case. Both devices, retrieved from a backpack discovered over a week after the girls vanished, painted a picture of desperation, fear, and a chilling silence that slowly consumed them. The phone activity began on April 1, the very day the girls were last seen. Liz and Samsung made the first emergency call to 112, the international emergency number. It lasted for just a second due to no signal. A second attempt followed a minute later, again failed. Just moments after, at 4:51 p.m., Chris's iPhone also tried dialing 112. That call too failed. These frantic attempts to reach help suggested that something had gone terribly wrong just hours into what was supposed to be a casual hike on the El Pinista Trail on April 2. Lsan's phone tried again, first at 6:58 a.m. and again at 10:53 a.m., both to 112. Still no success. The calls didn't connect, but the effort alone told a grim story. The girls were alive, stranded, and desperately trying to call out for help. Then that same morning, Chris's iPhone tried to call 911, Panama's emergency number, at 11:56 a.m., followed by more failed attempts throughout the day. On April 3, the calls continued in the morning, another to 911, then to 112, using both phones, but with each failed attempt hope dwindled. What followed next was even more unsettling. After April 5, the Samsung showed no further activity. Its battery had likely died. The iPhone, however, told a more cryptic story. On April 6, it was powered on again, but this time the correct pin wasn't entered. From that day onward, someone repeatedly attempted to unlock the phone, never successfully. The calls had stopped now. All that remained were silent failed attempts to access the device, as if Chris herself had been separated from her phone, or worse, someone else was trying to use it. Between April 7 and 11, the iPhone was switched on multiple times, brief flickers of activity in the dark, but with no further calls, no photos, no messages, just a cold, lifeless glow each time the screen was lit. The final activity came on April 11 at 10:51 a.m. when the phone was turned on for the last time. After that, nothing. The timeline left behind by the phones is one of the most disturbing elements in the mystery. It's as if the devices were their last lifeline, slowly dimming along with their chances of survival, and while no call ever connected the signal, they left behind a trail of unanswered cries. Still echoes through the jungle and through every unanswered question in this haunting case. But the story the phones told wasn't just about failed calls, it was about what didn't happen, about the silence that followed, and the disturbing gaps that raise far more questions than answers. Why, for instance, on April 11, Chris' iPhone was turned on for exactly 64 minutes, a full hour. No call was placed, no message typed, no photo taken, just an hour of eerie silence with the screen on. Was someone scrolling through it, trying to figure out how to use it, or did that glowing screen shine in the middle of the jungle, lighting up a final moment of helplessness? And after that, nothing. The phone was never used again. No further attempts to power it on, no final messages, no last goodbye. In a case that left behind hundreds of photos, attempted emergency calls, and desperate signals. The most baffling part might just be this: why didn't they leave a message? No farewell, no explanation, no note typed into the phone's memo, just silence. These unanswered questions continue to haunt everyone who's followed the case, because in the end the phones didn't just tell a story of what happened, they left behind the most bizarre and disturbing turn of events that is enough to keep one up all night. In the years since Chris and Liz Ann's disappearance, the case has sparked a wave of intense, often polarizing theories, each one attempting to shed light on the tragic mystery, with each new angle a deeper layer of intrigue and tension unfolds as the truth remains locked somewhere in the shadows of the jungle. One of the most chilling theories to emerge is the foul play theory, which suggests that the two women were not just lost but were victims of something far darker, perhaps a kidnapping or even murder. The case is filled with suspicious details that seem to point to foul play. The bizarre images on their cameras, some of which show unsettling, unexplainable scenes, and the fact that their remains were only found months after large-scale search efforts had turned up nothing. The timing of their deaths so far removed from the last known search raises the uncomfortable possibility that someone, a third party, may have been involved. And then there's the possibility of tampering. Could their belongings have been staged, the camera manipulated to create a false narrative? The theory lingers in the back of people's minds, unshakable and haunting, but as theories swirl, one stands out for its bizarre and controversial nature: the unrequited love theory. This one is fueled by rumors circulating in dark corners of the internet, suggesting a deep hidden tension between the two women. According to this theory, Chris harbored unspoken love for Liz, and a love that was never reciprocated. The story goes that a tense argument between the two led Chris to a moment of explosive anger, pushing Liz Ann off a cliff in a fit of unrestrained emotion. Racked with guilt, the theory claims Chris wandered aimlessly through the jungle until her own death. This theory, however, is riddled with holes. There's no concrete evidence to back up these claims, no signs of a violent confrontation or a hidden romantic relationship. Most dismiss it as a sensational rumor, but it still lingers, unsettling in its intensity. Then there's the organ trafficking theory, a more sinister and outlandish claim. According to this theory, the host family in Bokiet somehow got involved with organ traffickers, leading to the two women being abducted on the trail. The idea is that they were held captive for days, maybe even subjected to a horrific fate, before being killed. While the suggestion of organ trafficking stirs unease, the lack of any credible evidence to support this theory makes it seem highly unlikely. Investigators have pointed out the absence of proof, leaving the theory to fizzle in the background, a haunting whisper rather than a legitimate possibility. Despite these wild and chilling theories, there's still a sizable group of experts who hold fast to the accident theory, a much simpler but no less tragic explanation. According to this perspective, Chris and Liz Ann simply went off the beaten path, becoming disoriented in the dense, unforgiving jungle. It's easy to imagine how quickly the environment could have turned against them: rugged terrain, sudden injuries, the crushing isolation of the jungle. One of them could have been hurt, forcing the other to venture out for help. The theory suggests that they eventually succumbed to the dangers of exposure, starvation, and the unforgiving landscape, with no way to escape. While it's a hard theory to accept, it's one that for many fits the known facts best: an accident, tragic and unavoidable, in a place where survival is a constant battle against nature. Each theory has its own unique set of supporters, and with every new piece of evidence the questions grow. But the one thing that remains clear in this case is that Chris and Liz Ann's final hours are shrouded in mystery, leaving behind only fragments of truth and endless speculation. The mysterious case of Chris and Liz Ann has refused to fade into the past. Over the last 5 years, the story has continued to captivate the public's imagination, drawing attention, theories, and intense scrutiny. In 2021, Dutch authors Maria West and Jurgen Snuren stirred the pot once again with the release of their book. The authors, having spent countless hours combing through police files and records, uncovered new perspectives and inconsistencies that had previously gone unnoticed. Their work seemed to breathe new life into the case, offering alternative theories that reignited public fascination. The unresolved questions they uncovered left many wondering, had the official narrative been wrong all along? As the years rolled on, the 10th anniversary of the women's disappearance in April 2024 marked a significant milestone. Despite the passage of time, the case had not faded from memory. Instead, advances in forensic technology and the relentless curiosity of online sleuths led to renewed calls for the re-evaluation of evidence. Specifically the bones that had been found and the digital data from the women's phones. With the sharp precision of modern forensic methods, some wondered if hidden clues might finally come to light, possibly shedding new insights into what really happened to Chris and Liz. And in September 2023, the release of a film took the global spotlight back to the case, once again reigniting curiosity about the two girls' final days. The film's re-examination of the case, highlighting alleged investigative oversights, gave a different perspective to how evidence had been handled. People began questioning, were critical pieces of information overlooked? Were the investigations flawed from the start? As the media spotlight once more focused on the tragic story, it stirred a new array of debate and speculation, causing so many people to wonder if there was more to this haunting mystery than anyone had realized. With each passing year, the case only grows more enigmatic, its disturbing questions continuing to haunt those who dared to dig deeper. New angles, fresh evidence, and renewed curiosity make it clear this is a story that refuses to be forgotten. As the years have gone by, the families of Liz and Fr and Chris Kamers have steadfastly stood by the official conclusion of their loved one's tragic accident. Their belief in this explanation has offered them a measure of closure, even as the rest of the world remains captivated by the mystery. For them, the story may have come to an end, but for everyone else, the puzzle lingers. The phone records, camera images, scattered remains, and lingering forensic uncertainties provide enough material to fuel a host of competing theories while the families try to heal. Investigators, journalists, podcast hosts, and online communities are still debating. Some see a tragic, albeit straightforward, misadventure in the treacherous landscape of Alpinista's rugged terrain. Others, however, sense the shadow of something far darker, a hidden truth that has yet to be uncovered. Liz and Chris's case has evolved into one of Panama's most confusing and talked about modern mysteries. Over the decades since their horrific hike, countless theories have surfaced, each more chilling than the last. Yet despite all the speculation, no definitive answer has emerged. As technology advances and new discoveries surface, there is always the possibility that one breakthrough, whether it's a fresh forensic analysis or a crucial new witness, could shed light on what truly happened during those final days. But until then, the questions remain unanswered, adding to the ever-growing sense of mystery that continues to surround the tragic deaths of Liz and Fun and Chris Kamers. As the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper, thank you for joining me here at MR Nightcare True Crime Stories. Remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep, and until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.